Hey TechKnowStuds! There's some attacks that can happen on your network. So in this video, we're going to talk about a few common attacks that could occur on your network. In this video, we're going to cover a lot of different ways that an attacker might attack a network. So let's jump into it. A denial of service attack is when an attacker is attempting to make a service or a resource unavailable to legitimate users. And so this can come into a lot of different forms. But one example of this is when an attacker tries to overwhelm that resource. So an example of this might be when this computer right here is trying to overwhelm this set of servers right here. Let's say this is a web server right here. And so this attacker is going to send a lot of requests to this server. Maybe it's ping requests, maybe it's requests for websites, maybe it's a request to open up a TCP connection, but whatever it is, it's going to send a lot of them over here, overwhelming this machine right here so that this can't deliver content or send content to legitimate sources. It can't serve up content to legitimate sources. And one thing that's interesting about this is this can be a fairly easy to execute, but it can be difficult to stop this type of attack from happening. And one reason is because you have to identify traffic from a attacking source and stop it from happening, but you run the risk of stopping legitimate requests as well. A Wi-Fi deauthentication attack is an example of a denial of service attack. Now, if there's a wireless client that has access to a wireless network, then what can happen is right at the end of when this client is done communicating, it will send a deauthentication message letting this wireless access point or wireless router know that it can disconnect this device from the network, and then it would shut down this connection right here. Well, what can happen is that an attacker could send this deauthentication message to this wireless access point and let it know that, yeah, I am this machine right here and I want to disconnect. So essentially it's mimicking this message that this machine would send, and then this access point would say, okay, I will disconnect you. And now this client no longer is authenticated on that network. Jamming is another example of a denial of service attack. And really what it does is it stops communication from happening through the airwaves, through wavelengths. And so when we have wireless networks that are connected, and let's use an example, let's say this is a Wi-Fi connection right here, and then this computer sends out, or maybe it's a device, sends out a similar frequency to what these two machines are talking on, that's stronger, that overwhelms the airwaves, where these two machines can't talk back and forth. And this type of attack can be carried out across phones, cellular phones, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or any other wireless signals. A DDoS attack is a type of denial of service attack. It's a distributed denial of service attack. And so the idea behind this is that you have multiple machines that are launching the attack to overwhelm some sort of service or resource. So in this example right here, let's say we have a web server right here, and it's not just one machine, but many machines launch a flood of information or a flood of requests, whether it's an ICMP request or TCP request or some sort of web page request or whatever it is, it's flooding this server right here with requests so it can't send out legitimate traffic. And this is especially hard to combat against because all of these machines are coming from different sources. So it's hard to identify what is the culprit, what is the machine that you need to cut access to, and are you cutting access from legitimate sources. A trust exploit is when a machine exploits a trust. And so what does that look like? Let's say we have a machine right here that's able to get onto this bank of web servers and be able to program it or set it up or do some sort of configuration on it. And so it is trusted with these web servers right here. But it doesn't allow an attacker to gain access to this resource right here. It blocks that type of communication. But if this attacker right here gains access to this machine right here, then through this machine, it now has access to this bank of web servers here. So it's exploiting the trust connection that these two machines have and going through that to access an area that it's not supposed to have access to. Snooping is when someone gains access to data that they're not supposed to have access to. Network sniffers is when you are actually listening to traffic across the network. So an example is, let's say there's a network across here and communication is going back and forth. If this machine is listening into that conversation and looking at the packets that are going back and forth, then that is a network sniffer. It is looking at the packets. Now, one thing that's important about this is not necessarily an attack. This could be a good intent or bad intent. I've gone onto the networks that I've managed before and sniffed out these packets to see what was happening on the network and see if we had some issues, any kind of issues on the network, or to troubleshoot an issue that's on the network. And one piece of program that can actually help us do that is Wireshark, which is a really cool program to be able to dig in and see what's happening on your network. Eavesdropping is when you listen in to a secret conversation. It could be just you're listening in with your ear at the door to a conversation that you're not supposed to be listening to, or it could be on your networks using something like a packet or network sniffer to be able to listen to that traffic on there. And that can also lead to snooping, where you actually gain access to data that you're not supposed to have. Wiretapping is a form of eavesdropping. Specifically, it's about unauthorized monitoring and intercepting of electronic communication. Where eavesdropping can be a little more general than that, this is specifically around electronic communication. Eavesdropping can also lead to replay attacks. A replay attack is when some device replays a certain part of the communication to do something like gain access to another system or create some sort of delay. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say this machine is authenticating with this machine right here. So it's trying to authenticate with this machine, and this machine is listening into that conversation. The attacking machine is listening into the conversation. During this exchange, the password gets sent to authenticate with the server, but it gets sent encrypted. And so this attacking machine doesn't actually know what the password is, but it can replay that password in its encrypted form to get access to this machine right here. So if it's not the proper authentication protocols that you're using, this machine can do a replay attack to gain access to this server over here. An on-path attack is when a machine or an attacker sits in between two devices that are communicating. And so it's different than a packet sniffer or a network sniffer. In this case right here, we have a machine right here, and it's not just listening to the conversation going back and forth between these two devices. Instead, the communication is actually being sent through this device right here. Hence the name man in the middle or on path. Man in the middle is another term for this. So what the advantage of this is now this machine can do things like eavesdrop and listen to the conversation, create a delay between these two devices, or perhaps it's sending the wrong information to one or both of these devices. So there are many reasons why this would be carried out, but this is the on-path or man-in-the-middle attack. Spoofing is when you pretend to be somebody or something else. And so a spoofing attack is just an imitation attack. And so what you're doing is you're imitating another machine, you're imitating an IP address, you're imitating a MAC address, you're imitating a DHCP server, an access point, a DNS server. There are many ways that you can actually spoof on networks nowadays. And so it just means that you're pretending to be somebody else. So an example of this is maybe this machine is talking to this server right here, and then this machine steps in, and there's ways that this machine can pretend to be this one right here, or spoof this machine right there. So that's an example of spoofing, and there's once again a lot of different ways that this actually could go about, even things like email spoofing when somebody is pretending to be somebody else on email. Evil twin is a type of spoofing attack. So let's say this machine wanted to spoof this access point right here. Well, what it could do is it could start sending out messages pretending to be this access point. Therefore, what happens is that this machine right here connects to this attacking machine rather than the proper access point. So evil twin is when the attacker spoofs a access point, a wireless access point. Encryption is great because two machines can talk back and forth without other devices seeing it, unless there's a compromised key. If there's a compromised key attack, so this machine somehow gains access to the key that's used to encrypt this data back and forth, then any of the traffic that goes back and forth, this machine would be able to decrypt and see what that communication is actually happening between those two different devices. Session jacking is when an attacker takes over a session. So if this machine sets up a session or a connection with this web server right here, it could use a token to maintain that communication back and forth. Well, if this token is compromised, then this attacker can actually take over that session and gain unauthorized access to data or whatever is on this web server. An injection attack is when an attacker will inject some sort of malicious input into an application to create some sort of unintended function, to be able to leverage the system. So really what this looks like, and we'll give a couple examples here in a second, is let's say this is a web application that's running right here, there's a database on the back end, and there is some sort of user face on the machine. And maybe it's asking for some sort of information on there, and you input information in the form of some sort of code or script or something that's not intended. Maybe it's asking for a username, but you've put in some sort of script in there that gets sent now as an input into this web server. And then this web server maybe divulges some information, or you change information on this backend database. One example of an injection attack would be a SQL injection. So here we have a web server right here, and we have a database server right here. And the communication that happens between these is that these web servers request information and change information on the database server. So if a user requests information from these web servers may go grab some information and then send it to this machine right here. Or perhaps there's some data entry that happens, and so it modifies this database. Well, the communication between this web server right here and this database server is a SQL language. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and it's a language that you send these queries to the database to get information and retrieve information. Well, what can happen is if there's a user prompt right here, a user can put in this SQL language into here. Instead of something like a username, it would send it to the web server. The web server treats it as if it's just simple data, a username, and sends it to the database. And that tricks the database into executing that SQL code or that SQL language. XSS is actually pronounced cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is what that stands for. And so cross-site scripting is when it's similar, it's a type of injection. It's similar to like a SQL injection, but in this case right here, it's injecting a script. And so you inject script into an input that gets sent over to the web server and then compromises this web server. Then this is going to be sent out to other users, and then the other users are going to have this script play on their computers, on their machines, compromising those machines. So as you can see, there's a lot of different types of attacks, and this is not the full list. This is just some common ones that are out there that you need to watch out for. New vulnerabilities are found every day, and so new attacks are evolving and changing, and we constantly have to be vigilant about finding new ways to combat these type of attacks. So this is important to keep these in mind so we know steps that we need to take to keep our network secure.